Welcome to the Explainer. Let's just jump right in because today we are unpacking an epic, honestly, almost comic book style ideological battle for the absolute future of our post crisis world. We are living through a massive historical pivot right now, and basically two radically different paradigms are fighting to become the permanent blueprint for our new reality. On one side, you have this elite top down institutional restructure, and on the other, a completely grassroots bottom up civil rebellion. So, which one is actually going to shape the rest of our century? Let's figure it out.
First things first, to understand where we're going, we have to recognize where we are. Nothing will ever return to the broken sense of normalcy that prevailed prior to the crisis. That's a direct quote from the architects of the top-down movement, and it perfectly sets the tone. Both factions in this clash actually agree on one absolutely fundamental thing. The old world is gone. A completely new paradigm isn't just possible, it's inevitable, because the status quo was fundamentally broken to begin with.
Section 1. Our fragile world.
So how exactly did we get to a point where the entire global system needs either a massive reset or a total rebellion? Well, our 21st century world is incredibly interconnected. It moves with insane velocity and complexity. But that exact complexity is what made us deeply, deeply fragile. The sources describe a systemic, total failure of global institutions, a bankruptcy of what they call the holy trinity of power, meaning the church, politics, and the economy. The recent global pandemic didn't necessarily invent the cracks in our society, it just totally exposed them. It showed us just how vulnerable the modern individual has become while stuck inside this massive institutional web. And to give you a really pragmatic example of how broken that old normal actually was, check out the European wealth paradox. We almost always assume that highly developed, wealthy Western nations automatically have the fairest societies, right? But the data tells a completely different story. Highly developed nations with massive renter populations, places like Germany and Denmark, actually suffer from extremely high wealth inequality. Meanwhile, Eastern European countries like Slovakia, where citizens were able to buy their state-owned homes for incredibly cheap after the regime change, have outstandingly low wealth inequality. The old system was literally hiding these massive structural imbalances right beneath the surface.
Section 2. The Great Reset. Which brings us to the very first faction in this clash, the top-down architects. The book COVID-19, The Great Reset by Klaus Schwab and Thierry Malloret lays out an institutional blueprint. It's essentially an attempt by the global elite, major governments, and massive corporations to intensely manage our complex world. They basically view recent global crises as a window of opportunity to save the system from itself. How? By vastly strengthening the power of institutions and forging really deep, heavily integrated public-private partnerships. And you really have to understand just how insanely comprehensive this plan is. The Great Reset framework is operating on three distinct levels. First, you have the macro reset. That's about revamping massive, overarching structures like the global economy and geopolitics. Then comes the micro reset, which pushes specific industries to aggressively accelerate digitalization and totally restructure supply chains. And finally, the individual reset. This one literally anticipates and strongly encourages a top-down redefinition of our personal behavior, our consumption habits, and even how we relate to nature. We're talking about a completely coordinated global systemic overhaul. At the economic core of all of this is something called stakeholder capitalism. Now, on paper, it sounds pretty great. Instead of just ruthlessly chasing quarterly profits for shareholders, corporations are supposed to adopt ESG standards: environmental, social, and governance. The idea is that these mega corporations are now tasked with directly serving society and protecting the environment. But as we're about to explore, relying on the world's biggest corporations to voluntarily act as the ultimate guardians of our social welfare, that sets the stage for a massive ideological conflict. Section 3. The dark side of surveillance. Because frankly, whenever you have this much centralization of power, massive risks inevitably follow. Critics point to the severe danger of punitive solutionism. This is the risk of using concepts like health or workplace safety as a pretext to build what is essentially a technological dictatorship. Think about it. Under the guise of keeping you safe, companies can normalize total digital surveillance, thermal cameras, distancing apps, that ultimately just end up monitoring your every move and productivity. The extreme danger here is the nonstop harvesting of biometric data. We're talking about tracking your heart rate or even analyzing your emotions. If governments and megacorporations merge that kind of power, they aren't just predicting what we do, they literally gain the ability to manipulate our political views and our feelings. And honestly, these fears are not new at all. History gives us blaring warning signs. Look back at the 19th century truck system.
Factory owners literally controlled where their workers lived and paid them in tokens that were only valid at company-owned stores. It was a complete trap of total dependency. Or look at classical literature, like Imre Madach's Phalanstery or the concepts of Charles Fourier. They envision these hyper-rational dystopian futures where humans completely lose their individuality, wear identical uniforms, and are reduced to just numbers optimized for utility. Critics argue that modern surveillance capitalism is basically just the digital 2.0 version of that exact same institutional dependency.
Section 4. The Great Giving Back. So if that top-down approach runs the risk of sliding into technological totalitarianism, what's the alternative? Enter our challenger faction. This completely opposing paradigm is called the Great Giving Back. It is a wildly dynamic, bottom-up, grassroots civil movement. Instead of sitting around relying on the global elite to save us, it calls for Pentecost 2.0, a spontaneous, collective human awakening. They are demanding a tabula rasa, a totally clean slate, flat-out rejecting those old vertical power structures. Think of it as DIY 2.0. It's a do-it-yourself reclaiming of power where everyday individuals dismantle institutionalized manipulation and literally take back control of their own reality. And their economic vision is incredibly forward-looking. They call it the end of false capitalism. So unlike the Great Reset, which just wants to, subtly tweak the current corporate system with some ESG scores, the Great Giving Back wants a full, uncompromising audit of the entire system. They want to absolutely eradicate our waste-based civilization. I mean, a system driven by planned obsolescence where products are literally designed to break? They want it gone. It's a very radical, pragmatic demand to end the double standards of the global elite and reclaim morality right back to the individual level. You can really see this clash when it comes to our social contract. The Great Reset visualizes big government and major institutions just rewriting the rules from the top, and they expect citizens to just passively adapt and obey. The Great Giving Back completely rejects that. Instead of a rewrite, they propose an update. They view humanity's past social achievements, specifically the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as our foundational operating software. They're basically saying, hey, we don't need a new contract drafted by megacorporations. We need the people to directly upgrade, patch, and fiercely enforce the human rights we've already achieved. Section 5. Clash of Two Futures. Okay, so we've explored both philosophies. Let's map this out clearly so the radical differences between these two paths are totally coherent and easy for everyone to grasp. It is a completely stark contrast. Look at control. The Great Reset is strict top-down management by a coalition of governments and corporations. The Great Giving Back? Pure bottoms-up, driven by a civil DIY awakening. Economically, you have stakeholder capitalism, which relies on corporate goodwill and ESG, versus the end of false capitalism, which demands a total systemic audit. And when it comes to power, it's a future of intense technological surveillance versus a fierce, uncompromising drive to eradicate institutional dependency entirely. It's a massive, fundamental clash over who gets to dictate our reality. And if you want a highly pragmatic, solution-oriented example of this exact clash happening in the real world right now, look at local municipal power. Global megacorporations are constantly trying to push these universal ESG norms from the top down, but the sources point out a huge loophole. Corporate policies cannot legally override local municipal law. Enter Amsterdam. The city government there adopted what's called the donut model. It's a bottom-up, city-led economic framework that sets its own unique rules to make sure both the social foundation and ecological limits of their specific city are met. It totally proves that local power, driven by actual elected citizens rather than unelected global CEOs, can successfully push back against that corporate overreach. Section 6. Which path do we choose? So this isn't just some theoretical philosophy we're talking about here. It is a very real, practical battle happening in our cities and across our digital lives right this second. As the authors of The Great Reset admit themselves, we are now at a crossroads. Our society is currently navigating a completely massive bifurcation. The old status quo is totally gone. The only real certainty we have is that profound tectonic changes are already in motion. We are right now deciding the foundational architecture of the entire 21st century. We are caught squarely between an elite institutional restructure trying desperately to save a failing system and a collective grassroots civil reawakening trying to build something completely new.
So I'll leave you with this absolutely crucial question to think about. Will you be managed or will you awaken? Seriously, will our entire future be defined by the top-down, surveillance-heavy management of the Great Reset, or will it be defined by the empowering, bottom-up, grassroots update of the Great Giving Back? The answer isn't written yet. It depends entirely on which path we collectively choose to support. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer today, and I really encourage you to dive into these concepts further. Until next time.